Picture a university graduation ceremony at the University of the West Indies, the Mona campus. You look out into the sea of graduates, future doctors, lawyers, civil servants, the people who will effectively run the country in 10 or 15 years. What do you see? According to the data, you are seeing an overwhelming majority of women. In some faculties, the ratio is staggering. Now flip the scene. Go to a street corner in a marginalized community during the middle of a workday, or look at the statistics for remedial education programs. Who do you see there? Predominantly young men. This isn't an anecdote. This is the demographic reality of modern Jamaica. We often talk about gender equality as a finish line we're trying to cross, usually focusing on the barriers women face. But there is a parallel, silent crisis that has been brewing for decades. It's the systematic underperformance and disengagement of boys and men. Today we are looking at the changing gender dynamic in Jamaica, not to diminish the strides women have made, which are monumental, but to ask a hard question. Why are Jamaican boys falling behind, and what does a society look like when half its population lacks the tools to participate fully?
It is a hard question, Noah, and it's one that makes people uncomfortable because it can feel like a zero-sum game. But if we look at the numbers, the trend is undeniable. We aren't just talking about a bad year or two, we're looking at a structural shift that has been solidifying over the last few decades. The Planning Institute of Jamaica and the Statistical Institute of Jamaica, Statin, have released data sets that are remarkably consistent. In almost every metric of formal educational attainment, girls are outperforming boys. Girls are less likely to drop out of secondary school.
I want to pause on that because the immediate counterargument is often historical. Someone listening might say, well, men held the keys to the castle for centuries. Isn't this just the pendulum swinging back? Why is this a crisis rather than just a correction?
That's the most common critique, but it misses the nuance of what is actually happening on the ground. A correction would imply a move toward balance. What we are seeing is a new form of imbalance that carries significant social risks. We have to look at this through the lens of social stability. If you have a large cohort of young men who are uneducated, underemployed, and lacking in purpose, that is a recipe for volatility. It impacts crime rates, it impacts family stability, and it impacts the economy's ability to grow. You cannot build a developed nation if 50% of your potential workforce is disengaged.
So let's diagnose the sickness. If the symptom is disengagement, what is the root cause? Is this just about boys not liking school, or is there something deeper in the culture?
It's a convergence of factors, but we have to start with the family structure. In Jamaica, the phenomenon of the single mother household is widespread. Now, many of these mothers are incredible. They are the backbone of the society. But from a developmental psychology perspective, the absence of a consistent father figure or male role model has specific consequences for boys. Same-gender role modeling is critical during the formative years. Boys look to men to understand what male responsibility looks like, how to regulate their emotions, and how to channel their aggression into achievement. When that model is missing, you get confusion. You get boys trying to figure out manhood from peers or media, which often offer a distorted version of masculinity.
It's interesting you mentioned distorted masculinity. I feel like in the global conversation, we hear a lot about toxic masculinity. It's almost become a buzzword to shut down discussion. But is there a biological reality we're ignoring here? Are we expecting boys to behave like girls and then punishing them when they don't?
That is a crucial part of the puzzle. We have to define our terms carefully. Masculinity isn't just a cultural costume, it has behavioral and psychological components. Research from the American Psychological Association and sociological frameworks like those from R.W. Connell identify traits often associated with masculinity: assertiveness, courage, emotional regulation, and a problem-solving orientation. Biologically, we know there are hormonal influences. Testosterone drives competitiveness and goal-directed behavior. The problem in Jamaica isn't that these traits exist, it's that we're not developing them. We're not channeling them. A boy's competitiveness can make him a great CEO or a gang leader. The difference is structure and guidance. If you suppress that energy in a classroom by forcing a boy to sit still for 6 hours and focus purely on verbal expression, you lose him. He disengages because the environment feels hostile to his nature.
That brings us back to the classroom. You're suggesting the education system itself is biased against the way boys learn.
The evidence certainly points that way.
The Jamaican education system, like many modeled on the old British colonial style, prioritizes rote learning, verbal compliance, and stillness. These are areas where, developmentally, girls often mature faster than boys. Boys tend to respond better to experiential learning, competition, and project-based tasks, things that get them moving and solving problems physically or tactically. When schools remove those elements, boys feel like failures from a very young age. They internalize the idea that school is for girls or school is not for me. And once that identity sets in, that academic achievement is not a masculine trait, it is incredibly hard to reverse.
This idea of school is for girls seems to bleed into other institutions too. I've noticed a similar trend in the church. If you walk into a typical church service in Jamaica, the pews are filled with women. The choir is women. The activity leaders are women. Where are the men?
It mirrors the classroom almost perfectly. The church is a major pillar of Jamaican life, but it has become a space where men often feel peripheral. If the messaging, the worship style, and the community structure don't speak to male experiences or the desire for active leadership, men check out. They might attend physically, but they're not engaged spiritually or organizationally. This reinforces the vacuum. Boys growing up in the church see their mothers praying and leading, but they don't see their fathers doing it. So spiritual discipline also gets coded as feminine. This is dangerous because it leaves boys without a moral or spiritual framework for their masculinity.
So we have a breakdown in the home, the school, and the church. That's the trifecta of socialization. It sounds like we are failing to provide a rite of passage.
Exactly. That is the missing link. In many traditional cultures, and even in successful modern societies, there are structured pathways to manhood. There are moments where a boy is guided into responsibility. Jamaica has limited institutional frameworks for this. We have a lot of informal, peer-led socialization, which usually happens on the street corner, but very little formal mentorship. We have emphasized the empowerment of women, and rightly so, but we did not simultaneously define what positive masculinity looks like in this new world. We left a void, and nature abhors a vacuum.
I want to push on the empowerment of women point. Is it possible that in our rush to correct historical wrongs against women, we actively deprioritized men? Did we just forget about them, or was there a sense that men will be fine, they've always been fine?
I think it was largely the latter. There was an assumption of male resilience, that men, by virtue of historical privilege, didn't need specific support. Development agencies, NGOs, and government policies spent 30 years heavily investing in the girl child. Scholarships, advocacy, health programs, again, these were necessary. But while we were doing that, the economic ground shifted under men's feet. We moved from an agrarian and industrial economy to a service and information economy. The old male roles of physical provider and protector became harder to fulfill without high-level education. So while women were being equipped for the future, men were left with an outdated map. We are now seeing the result of that asymmetrical investment.
The economic angle is fascinating because it makes this a pragmatic issue, not just a cultural one. If men aren't working or not working at high levels, the country's productivity stalls. You mentioned manpower planning earlier. What are the long-term risks here if we don't fix this?
The risks are severe. First, you have the workforce imbalance. If your healthcare, legal, and administrative sectors are 80% female, you lack diversity of thought and approach in those critical fields. But more urgently, you have the issue of the unattached male, a young man with no degree, no job prospects, and no strong family role is a prime candidate for antisocial behavior. We see this in the crime statistics. We see it in the instability of new families being formed. If these men cannot become reliable providers or partners, the cycle of single-parent households continues. It becomes a generational feedback loop. The social safety net eventually buckles under that weight.
Okay, so the house is on fire. How do we put it out? Because it seems like just telling boys to step up isn't working. We need structural solutions.
We absolutely do, and it requires a deliberate, multi-pronged approach. It starts with educational reform. We need to redesign curricula to include more practical, project-based learning. We need to bring back competitive elements that boys respond to, not to exclude girls, but to engage boys. We need to see more male teachers in early childhood and primary education. Boys need to see men holding books, not just holding guns or microphones. They need to see that intellectual pursuit is a masculine endeavor.
That seems like a long-term fix. Getting more male teachers. What about right now? What can be done in the communities?
Mentorship is the immediate triage. We need structured mentorship programs connecting boys with positive male role models. This can happen through churches, community centers, and alumni associations, but it has to be formal. It can't just be, hope you find a mentor. It needs to be, here is a curriculum on discipline, goal setting, and emotional control. We need to teach values like responsibility and work ethic explicitly, the same way we teach mathematics. Churches in particular have a huge opportunity here to create male-focused ministries, spaces where men can talk about their challenges without judgment and learn spiritual leadership.
And what about the fathers? Because the state can't replace a dad. Is there a policy angle to strengthening fatherhood?
There is. We need social policies that encourage and facilitate active fatherhood. For a long time, the legal and social framework treated fathers mainly as financial providers, the wallet of the family. If they couldn't pay, they were pushed aside. We need to shift the narrative to emphasize their role as nurturers, mentors, and leaders within the home. Media plays a huge role here. We need public discourse that highlights positive examples of masculinity. Show the fathers who are present. Show the men who are leading responsibly. Reshape the aspiration. If a boy's only image of a powerful man is a don or a violent figure, that's what he will emulate. We have to flood the zone with better options.
It sounds like we need to rebrand masculinity in Jamaica. Not soften it, but elevate it.
Elevate is the perfect word. We aren't trying to make men more like women. We are trying to help them be the best version of men. We need to validate their natural inclinations, competitiveness, strength, drive, and channel those into socially beneficial activities. That is what healthy masculinity looks like. It protects, it provides, it builds. When you suppress it or ignore it, it turns toxic. When you cultivate it, it becomes the bedrock of a stable society.
There is a tension here that I think we need to acknowledge before we wrap up. There is a fear among some advocates that focusing resources on men will derail the progress of women. That if we start scholarships for boys or special programs for men, we're sliding backwards. How do you answer that?
I answer that by saying we're all in the same boat. If one side of the boat is leaking, the whole boat sinks. It is not a competition between genders, it is a partnership. Helping boys become responsible, educated, employed men actually benefits women. It creates better partners, better fathers, and a safer society for women to live and work in. The goal is equity, not dominance of one group over the other. We have done a great job lifting up our daughters. Now we must apply that same energy and intentionality to our sons. It is a strategic priority for national survival.
That's a powerful place to land. It reminds me that a society is an organism. You can't treat just one limb and expect the body to be healthy. The data from the Planning Institute, the realities at UWI, and the stories from our communities all point in the same direction. The alarm bell has been ringing for a while.
It has, and the time for just observing the data is over. We need intervention. We need every sector, government, church, private sector, and family to recognize that saving our boys is not an act of charity. It is an investment in our collective future.
This conversation really challenges the simple narratives we often hear about gender. It's not about heroes and villains, it's about systems, unintended consequences, and the hard work of balance. If this perspective on the Jamaican gender dynamic resonated with you, or if it sparked a debate you want to have with your own circle, pass this episode along.